Welcome! In this video I will show you the anti-Tarrasch. The Tarrasch is a position which arrives after the move c5. And by the way, I will show you a bunch of opening and middle game principles as well, so it's very helpful for you. And the c5 pawn immediately attacks the center of white. And you see this nice square in the center, and it's a bit chaotic maybe. Should you take here? Should you maybe take here? Shouldn't you take at all? Maybe just play knight f3. Well, you for sure don't want to take like this, because then the bishop gets out and has a safe development, right? You could go for positions like this, which should be equal, but this already gives up a pawn. But it is playable and the position is equal. Some great development here. So that's an option. And I like to capture this pawn first, right away, and give black an isolated queen's pawn, the IQP. Maybe if at some point trades happen here, this pawn is isolated, means not defended by another pawn, and that gives quite double-edged positions. I made a video on this as well, so check it out if you're interested. Here, knight f3, I like to play this move. Why? Well, if you ever take, then I'd like to take back with the knight. And that is one of the principles of playing the isolated queen's pawn's positions, is that you want to have a knight in front of the IQP, meaning it cannot move forward. And the opponent, in this position black, wants to play around the IQP with the bishops, for example, and get a lot of play. And at some point, at the right moment, maybe see if it could progress and trade off the IQP. So these are very briefly the plans that are possible in these kind of situations, but black here went for the move knight to f6, entering a very theoretical line. And I think this is where the anti-Tarrasch shows, because here there's a very concrete line of simply taking the pawn, and this pawn is now under attack twice. So taking the pawn back doesn't really work, because you simply take a pawn and you're a pawn up after queen b6, for example. You do have some threats, so yeah, white has some play in these kind of lines, but after e3 here, white will develop and likely have a good position. But black is ahead in development, so white needs to watch out. Instead, a very theoretical line is to play the move d4, kicking away the knight. Where does it want to go? Well, in this line, I like to keep the pawn. Can I defend it? Yes, I can. Now the question is, what is the right way forward? Maybe kick away the knight, but that gives some nice play for white, because you simply take the pawn. After you take back, the pawn is defended. By the way, this knight is also defended. Here we simply attack the pawn in the center of the board. White can develop the bishop with a check. We simply block it. If takes, well, then we can simply take it back, right? Why? Well, the knight is hanging, we saw that, but do you see a great double attack in this position? Bishop b5 attacking the rook and the unprotected knight. Loose pieces drop off. Both are loose. We can attack both and they cannot protect each other. Rook a5 and we take the knight with a check, and we are winning in this position. So here a good move is to simply take the pawn, and if we take the bishop, then of course now the queens eye each other. After a trade of queens, black can capture the bishop, and we can now develop the bishop with a check. And after the king moves to f8, we take the pawn and attack both loose pieces here as well. And after the pawn takes, then we end up in a position like this. We are a piece up compared to a pawn. White should be winning here, but a very interesting position. But clearly not the best option for black, and that's why bishop to c5 is the alternative move. You might be thinking, aren't we just simply giving up this bishop? Are we? Well, let's check it out. Because after knight takes on c5, do you see the right move for black in this position to save the game? There's only just one move. Yes, well spotted. Queen check, giving a check and attacking the knight at the same time. And here we need to block the check, of course. And after blocking the check from the queen, the knight falls. But how should we continue here? I think there's a very straightforward way of continuing. Maybe e3 is interesting, but I think as soon as you can get a tempo, you should get the tempo. And that's an option here by playing rook to c1. We develop the rook, ping the rook into the game, which is always good, and we attack the queen. And here the queen needs to move. So the queen goes to b6, maybe dropping back, but also attacking the b2 pawn. Are we going to defend that pawn or not? Well, let's see. We play the move e3, attacking this pawn. If black would take, then this pawn simply hangs, and here bishop c3 is winning for white. So that's not an option. Instead, another option for black is to play just knight to f6. And here we simply develop the bishop, eyeing here and castling at some point. And we allow black to take here, because it's a bit of a poison pawn, because the rook and maybe this rook at some point will also join the party, and we have a very strong position. After castles, it will look like this. Bishop g4, maybe takes, and then bishop to e3. We will also see a similar kind of pattern in the game, so let's not spend too much time on this now. D takes is an option, then we simply take. Here you don't really want to take, because then bishop c4, protecting this pawn, attacking this pawn, and yeah, white has a lot of development here. After knight here, knight g5 is a good option already to attack this pawn, and at some point we will castle. So for example, castle, we will go here and threaten checkmate. Bishop f5 is a good option, but now already we can take here because we attack this pawn 3 times as well. And we have a lot of play. So a check will be better. Then we block this check, and you don't want to take here because of similar reasons as before, but give a check, bishop in between, also developing of course. And after development, we simply castles, and yeah, after black castles as well, we are simply ahead in development. We have a healthy pawn structure. The rook will likely go here, eyeing on the queen, and the bishops might get very active in this game. White clearly has a small edge. Instead, bishop to g4. Also a very logical game, pinning the knight to the queen. So now I cannot take this pawn. And now there's basically 2 options. Either bishop to e2, which the computer likes. Rook d8 is a good option. And then queen to a4, for example. But I prefer to go for the more active move, bishop to c4, eyeing on the f7 square and castling next. And I have a very concrete idea to get rid of this pin at some point, which you will see. Knight to f6, castles, and here my opponent castles as well. The opening phase is over. We have our pieces developed. We both castled. My rooks are not connected yet because my queen is in between. I don't have a central pawn. My opponent does have a center pawn, but it is quite weak and not very much protected. And I think overall my white squared bishop is very active and very strong. And that's why, besides also the very active rook here, I have a small advantage. I decide to take the pawn, which is a good move. And after knight takes, do you see a very good move in this position? Because at the moment, this knight is attacked twice. I cannot really take it, right? Because then my queen falls, and that will be Pota's gambit. Let's not do it. But there is a good way to pin the knight. So bishop to e3, a very good move. Why is this so strong? Well, if you, for example, would take the knight with a check, we take back, and look what emerges on the board. We attack the bishop with the pawn, and we attack the queen. And black cannot defend both. So if you take, then we can simply take back, and the queen is still being attacked. Black can take a pawn, but I'm a piece up against 2 pawns in a very healthy position. So this is clearly winning for me. If you would take with the bishop, for example, well, then I could take here either with the bishop or with the queen, and the game goes on. And after a queen trade, the position is quite equal, and I can play the move f3 here, for example, preventing the knight from going to some nice squares. Instead, my opponent played the move rook to d8, which is a blunder. Why? Well, you need to calculate it very strictly, but it doesn't really work for black for concrete reasons, because you simply take the knight. Now, the queen is attacked, but if you would take, for example, the bishop, then I can take back with the queen. And now the knight is not pinned anymore. And in this position, I am clearly better, as I am a rook up. So here, my opponent takes the knight, but I have a very strong sequence of moves here. Queen takes f3 is not really an option, because then you simply take the bishop here. But there's a better option, and you take the queen, attacking the rook, attacking the pawn, attacking this bishop. Everything is under attack and black decides to take my queen with the rook, which is now not attacked anymore. Good move. Here bishop to c5 would have been a great move according to the computer. Attacking the rook, so giving me some tempo, and after takes with the check I take back. Rook to c8 doesn't really work, because now I can simply take the bishop. And you might think, well, am I not winning a bishop back? No, you're not. Because if you take, do you see the winning move here for white? Bishop, f7, check. The king has to go back. And now the rook is not protected. Loose pieces, drop off. And we take the rook. And this is a clearly winning position. Instead, I went for rook takes on d1, which is also a good move. And clearly keeps also the advantage. My opponent takes, and now I win a pawn. Very important. I'm a pawn up, and I have the strong bishop pair. So after the move bishop to a4, because the bishop was still under attack, what is a good way to continue here? There's multiple options, but I like the move f3, preventing the knight from joining the game. Rook to a8, attacking the bishop and also getting some activity on the a file, but remember, my pawn is still protected by the bishop, and I drop back the bishop. Black doesn't really want to allow for me to capture his knight, because then you take back and you have two double pawns, which is an advantage for me. And for me it's important to, in these kind of positions, make sure that I remain to have the same colored bishops as my opponent. So I want to keep my white squared bishop, as equal squared bishops are not as drawish as opposite colored bishops. Here my opponent goes for the move b5, attacking my bishop, and I need to make a choice. Where am I going? The downside of this move, and the computer doesn't really like this move, is that my opponent brings his pawn forward. And the more it goes forward, the further it moves up the board, the closer it gets to my pieces. And the easier it gets for me to attack and win this pawn. I play bishop to e2, centralizing the bishop and still eyeing on the b5 square. And you see already how my rook can start attacking this pawn. I don't start with the rook, but with the bishop from behind, and my opponent needs to act. Rook b8 is an option, but it's a passive move. Doesn't really work, and the rook is now merely a defender, while you want to have an active piece. b3 doesn't really work, because then I go a3, and sooner or later this pawn will fall. So my opponent goes for rook to c8, a good active move, and my bishop is now under attack. I cannot take the pawn, because then my rook falls. So I play the move bishop to e3, protecting the rook. And you don't really want to trade off rooks, because in this position after knight d5, I will simply at some point attack the b4 pawn, and with my bishop trade off this knight. I did say normally you don't really want to have opposite colored bishops, but with 2 pawns extra, that is actually winning. Rook e8. My bishops are lined up here and they might look weak, but with king to f2, great move. I protect both bishops and I activate the king. So I wanted to have my king into the game anyway. Great endgame principle is that you want to have an active king and it protects my bishops, which are super centralized. So I really like my position here. And this pawn is super weak. This bishop is out of the game and the knight is not very active yet. So my opponent activates his rook, attacking my bishop now twice, so I need to move it because I cannot defend it. And I play the move bishop to d2, attacking the pawn, and maybe my bishop will end up on c4, trading off the knight and then winning the b4 pawn. Here my opponent goes for a retreat of the bishop, bringing the bishop back into the game via this diagonal, and bishop to c4 would be a good option here. Bishop e6 and bishop e3. According to the computer, this is a good option, but I like my approach with rook to c5, attacking the rook, and maybe I can come in from behind. For example, after bishop to e6, what my opponent played, there is some access from behind, but I need to calculate everything very well. First, I play bishop to c4, attacking the knight and the bishop, and my opponent needs to act, because otherwise I will simply win a piece. Rook d8, also setting up a trap on the bishop, so here I need to be very cautious. King to e1, defending the bishop, and here the move h6, making room and making sure that there's no back rank checkmates anytime. Here h4 would have been a good move according to the computer, and I prevent the progress of g5 by my opponent, which is also an idea initiated by the h6 move, but instead I decide to go for rook to b5. I already said, you know, there's an option for me to go from behind, and that's what I do here. And here my opponent plays the move g5, but this simply loses a pawn, because I take the pawn, and knight to b4 wouldn't really work, because my bishop is protected. I can simply take, and yeah, the rook cannot really come in, because the king is very active. And yeah, we'll set up a defense in case my opponent attacks my pawns, or maybe go b4 right away. And yeah, with 2 pawns extra, this is clearly winning. So that's not what my opponent played, but he played the move knight to e3. Going for complications, attacking the bishop twice, attacking this pawn, so I need to act, and I take the bishop. Knight to g2 doesn't really work here, because I attack the knight here, and the knight has to retreat, and then I can keep my bishop. So I have an important tempo on the knight there. So instead I take the pawn, and my opponent has to take back, creating another weakness in my opponent's camp, because e6 is now a pawn island, and for me easier to capture it sooner or later. So that's why I like this move. g3 would have been a nice move according to the computer, really preventing the knight from taking it, but I saw another nice move, king to f2, attacking the knight, protecting the pawn at the same time. The rook cannot really get in, and I saw also a very concrete line here, because after check, it feels like I'm giving up a pawn, which I kinda am, but I win a pawn back. Do you see the very concrete sequence here? So king to g3 is not the right move, because then you simply do lose a pawn, and maybe this is holding for black. But instead, if you go king to e2, you attack the knight, and after takes, you also prevent the rook from coming in on the second row. So now I have this great move, bishop e7. Brilliant move. There is no check here, so the rook simply has to move. And if it goes to d7, what my opponent played, attacking the rook, do you see a great move here? I could take, but then after takes, I'm a pawn up. And this should still be winning, but it looks rarish. I think there's an even better move in this position, and that's taking on g5. Very strong move. An even better move, also according to the computer. Because now, both pieces are under attack. And if you take the bishop, I take the knight, and now I'm 2 pawns up, which is definitely winning. Instead, my opponent went knight to a4, going for a last resort, because he wants to go for the fork. And this is what I already saw and should have seen when I entered. After I played the move king to e2, I already foresaw that my bishop at some point could drop back to d2 to protect the c3 square and prevent the knight fork. Otherwise, this wouldn't have worked, right? So in this position, if this fork is actually threatened and I cannot defend it, then either my bishop hangs or my rook hangs. So bishop to d2, great move, only move in the position, and here rook to a7. Protecting the knight, because the knight is super restricted. It doesn't have any squares anymore. And maybe also going after the a2 square. I don't leave my opponent any room, so if you're better, you want to trade off pieces, because if all pieces are gone, let's say the rooks are gone, and the knight and the bishop are gone, I have 2 pawns extra, a passer on this side of the board, and the extra pawn here. And my opponent even has isolated pawns and pawn islands. So this is clearly winning for me. So you want to trade off pieces when you're ahead. And I play the move rook to a5. The rook can't defend the knight anymore. One last resort would have been to go rook to g7. But I simply take the knight, and yeah, black gets 2 pawns. But you know, at some point I will start pushing the a-pawn. The rook is a bit out of the game because of the bishop. And in this position, I play the move a5, put the rook behind it, and this is simply winning for me. Instead, my opponent took the rook, I took back, and my opponent resigned in this position because, yeah, 2 pawns against 4 is simply winning for me in the endgame, and there's nothing to be done. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you soon. Bye bye.